DeMatteis' strategic and compliance expertise and deep knowledge of federal and state governments to lead the coordination of millions of dollars in federal stimulus and COVID relief funds the state received for pandemic response and economic stabilization. Previously, Claire was nominated by Governor Carney and confirmed by the Delaware Senate in 2019 to serve as Commissioner of the Department of Correction, DOC, the state's largest law enforcement agency. She was the first woman to lead the Delaware's correctional system with the dual mission of public safety and offender rehabilitation. In 2017, she was appointed as the governor's special assistant to the Department of Correction following the riot, you might remember, in the murder of a correctional officer in the state's maximum security prison. And within 1 year, she worked with the DOC team to implement more than 40 reforms. Prior to returning to state government service, Claire served as senior counsel to then U.S. Senator Joe Biden from 94 to 2004. And from 2004 to 2016, she served in the private sector as a partner in a law firm and a senior executive, general counsel, and chief compliance officer for 2 multi-billion-dollar corporations. Claire has been an adjunct professor at the University of Delaware and serves as a university trustee. She was born, raised, and lives in Delaware. She received her undergraduate degree from the University of Delaware and her law degree from Delaware Law School. We invited Charles, I said, to come interview, so right now you get to enjoy the inside with Claire DeMatteis and Charles Elson.
Well, you know, let me turn this on. There we go. No, it's not on. There it is. This is great. You know, there are very few people who have done as many different interesting things as Claire. I think you were a broadcast journalist too.
I was.
So, I mean, so look, we've got the. It's funny, in this state, she's covered so much of the waterfront. The only thing you haven't done, you haven't been a judge. You're going to do that next? There was one kind of, Bill Quillen kind of did that a couple of times. Maybe.
I was a attorney judge at Delaware Law School for student competition, and there was this huge sign in front of me that said, Justice DeMatteis. And many of you that know my mom, she worked for the courts for her whole career. And I said, can I take that home with me? Because my mom is going to love it. It's the only time she's ever going to see those 2 words together.
But it's great. It's great being able to be the interlocutor, you know, the questioner. Claire probably understands, has a greater understanding of this state's history and its politics than most anyone in this room, certainly me. And understanding, well, we have a state senator, former state senator here, but Claire's been around. And so I thought it would be fun to talk a bit. We've discussed before, Inside Edition in Delaware Today. Delaware Today, Inside Rotary Today, Inside Delaware Today. And I thought she would be terrific getting her thoughts on a couple sort of recent controversies, if you will, that have been in the news and involve Delaware. And I'm really curious as to how she views it. And the first one that y'all have heard a lot about, particularly if you drove around and saw a lot of yard signs, was called Senate Bill 21. Everyone here familiar with Senate Bill 21? Yeah. This was a bill that changed the corporate code dramatically in Delaware. It's the first time in almost 50 years that we've had that kind of review, and it attracted tremendous controversy on both sides of the aisle. One side saying that if it passed, it would be without it, the state would lose its corporation revenue. The other group said if it didn't pass, that the state would die and you'd lose your corporate revenue. And so, in other words, you know, there's an old joke about this governor of Georgia named Talmadge years ago. He got reelected, but before he could be sworn in, he was sick. He was dying, and he was in the hospital, and someone came to see him and said, "Governor, you're an amazing man." He said, "Really, why?" he said, for the first time in my memory, you've got the entire state of Georgia praying for you at once. He said, really? I said, yeah, half praying you'll live, half praying you won't. Senate Bill 21.
Senate Bill 21 is now law. The governor signed it the day that it passed. And I think, Charles, the reason you want to bring it up, particularly in a group dedicated to civility, what Rotary does, is it was a divergent path of civility we're used to in Delaware. We've all heard about the Delaware Way. Senator Margaret, Henry, Kathy, many of us in this room live it. And what does the Delaware Way mean? Because I think the term has gotten overused. In my mind, it means the civility built on relationships, respect, to get something done. We pride ourselves in Delaware on delivering results. And I think what happened with Senate Bill 21, as you saw firsthand, I was a bystander. I had no role in it whatsoever other than to read about it. But what you and I experienced was a lack of civility. It's not how we do things. We don't have an insider come in from New York, finance a campaign, and then literally behind the scenes lobby to change us, the most significant law in the state. We don't call up a former Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court and a former Chancellor literally on a Saturday morning and say, write this bill. You know, when we change laws in Delaware, it goes through a process, and it goes through a full debate. And what feels different about this is that chink in the armor. It truly was an example of a lack of civility, a lack of relationships, a lack of respect, and so it happened. Now what I will look for, imagine what many of you will look for, is what happens next. Let's make sure this doesn't become a pattern. Let's make sure our voices are heard that say that this is not how we want things to get done. And if it isn't working, if the institutional investors who were against the bill, if they're right, if it truly does cause a decrease in our corporate franchise tax, then we would expect members of the General Assembly to act. And I have confidence in the General Assembly that they will do that. That if this was the wrong course, I believe that they will correct it. But it is certainly a negative, with everything negative, and I think the way you started this meeting was beautiful, talking about the chaos going on around us. Where everything going on, the chaos around us, we don't expect that in Delaware. And my hope in my, almost 35 years in Delaware politics is that it doesn't become a pattern.
I really hope you're right. It's funny because I was down to testify on the thing, and actually it was funny, what I had thought about, and I was going to testify, is the thing on the wall over there, the 4 truths. And it was interesting because I said, looking at the bill and the process and how it got there, I went down the 4, and did it pass muster? And the answer was no. In the end, all 4 failed. At least in my opinion. And I was going to talk a little bit about it, but I only had a minute. So, those car ads where the guy goes real fast? I don't think it's a good bill. Thank you. Goodbye. Anyway, but it is interesting how those, I hadn't thought about those in years. And it's interesting how if you take them and apply them just to a simple political controversy, it does get you to the right answer. So just an ad for Rotary. I've been Rotarian 1996, almost 30 years. That actually is a great thing. But the question is, it's happened. How, the old joke, a reputation so hard to gain, so easy to lose. How do we get our reputation back nationally at this point? Because that really, whether the investor class or the academic class, they were pretty, even our judiciary was pretty banged around in this thing. How do we do it?
If I were planning it behind the scenes, which is how I've lived a lot of my political life, is supporting the main person behind the scenes, I would bring people together, whether it's lunch, whether it's what Ronald Reagan used to do in the White House and have members of Congress and their staffs over for drinks every Wednesday night. I think we need that relationship building back. I'm afraid if we don't do that, then the 2 sides just get further apart, and you know how it is. Say it to my face. don't walk out of a room and talk about me. Say it to my face. And if you don't bring people together in a lunch setting, in a casual setting, a social setting, a breakfast setting, you lose that opportunity. You know, one of the best things our former governors, and I believe it was Pete DeMatteis that started it, Margaret, you may correct me, was he started the leadership lunch and the members of the General Assembly. And every Tuesday, they would meet at Woodburn, the leadership with the governor, all parties, and they would work through issues, bills that were coming up to the floor, budget issues, tax issues, revenue issues, and the governor continues that today. And sadly, the people who attend, the numbers who attend dwindle Tuesday after Tuesday after Tuesday, year after year after year. And that is what worries me in a state like Delaware, that our brand is our civility. That's our brand. Our brand is getting things done, attracting businesses, phenomenal Rotaries, phenomenal chambers of commerce. I'm afraid that once we start to lose that brand, then all of us who pride ourselves on being Delawareans and want to hear that you're raised and went to UD and went to Delaware Law School, like that's home to me. That will be my concern, and I will work behind the scenes, as I know many of you will, to try and make sure that doesn't happen.
One thing that came out in the thing that I thought was interesting in one of the hearings is that someone asked, I can't remember what state legislator asked, it was of the House, and they said to the Secretary of State, why are we so dependent on the franchise revenue? In other words, if it decreases, in most states, nobody would care. In this state, if it decreases, obviously we care substantially because it makes up, if you add PIT and everything else, it's probably about 2/3 of our budget, somewhere in there, maybe a little less, a little more. That's a big number. Where shouldn't there be other sources of economic activity in this state other than corporate regulation? And I go back to, because, and I remember thinking, she's absolutely right. That is really the great question. Not how do we save the franchise, not save the franchise. You can't, when you decide a public policy on a revenue generation basis, ultimately the policy is going to get a bit screwed up because the two don't really relate, if you think about it. The corporate policy and political policy, they're different. They get at different things. But the question is that we're so dependent on it, can we separate political policy from corporate policy? So I guess for you is, how do we broaden this debate? How do we get out, other than civility? That's simple.
Sure.
How do we get out of this pickle?
We don't if we want to continue to be one of 5 states without a sales tax. And I remember, even I worked for Mike Castle when he was governor his final year, and it was an education because they did have to raise some taxes, and it was, I learned the term that in Delaware, we like to export our taxes. Whether it's people driving along, New Jersey to want to get to our beaches, or people from DC that want to get to our beaches, we have tolls, and we have corporate franchise tax fees. But we try and keep our personal income tax low. Lord knows we keep our real estate taxes low compared to our neighboring states. We like to increase cigarette and alcohol taxes because people from Maryland and neighboring states come in because our taxes are so much lower than theirs. So that term has always stuck with me, that in Delaware we do a really good job of exporting our taxes. And the franchise tax is part of that. But the franchise tax is built on the fact that when Delaware was founded, they had the brilliance of continuing the English tradition of a court of equity. That is as basic to Delaware as our landmass. It was brilliant that our founders started, and we still are one of the only ones that have a true court of equity. And legislative leaders and governors through the years have understood that is what makes Delaware that special. And we should from it in terms of corporate franchise taxes. If the companies want to have the benefit of our judges and the wisdom of our law, then the right to that is paying a corporate franchise tax. I don't think the average Delawarean understands how critical that revenue is to our state. It funds our nonprofits, it keeps our taxes low, it prevents us from having a sales tax. And I don't think the General Assembly ever wants to have a conversation about implementing a sales tax although you can argue that our gross receipts tax is a hidden sales tax. But for increasing the gross receipts tax or sales tax, that's why they've created additional revenue, even like the marijuana, if that ever gets up and going. The marijuana tax, what we've done with our lottery. Remember it was Joe Biden as head of the Senate Judiciary Committee when Congress passed a law banning sports betting who grandfathered in Delaware. And that's why we were one of the first states before the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. We were one of only 2 states that could do sports betting. And now lotteries and sports betting is a significant part of our revenue. So we have been creative. The General Assembly, I should say, governors have been creative in building our tax base. But the corporate franchise tax is, I think, as basic to Delaware as our, the fact that we're 96 miles long. I don't see how you change that.
Is there, what sort of industry would you bring to Delaware if you, let's say, magic wand, and you could say, this is the sort of businesses I want to see come to Delaware to broaden our tax base outside of the franchise? What would you look for? What kind of businesses do you think would find us attractive and we would find attractive? Because actually, it's a wonderful place to do business if you think about it. It's near a lot of things. The real estate values are decent. The taxation structure is decent. This should be a place that people really would be interested in coming. But if you could pick industries, what would you do? What would you think about?
I would build on what we already know works. The DuPont spinoffs. They've created, it's got to be millions of jobs by now. All the spinoffs from our biotech and scientific companies. I wouldn't try and create something completely different. What Pete DuPont, the General Assembly, did with the Delaware Financial Development Act was brilliant in terms of bringing more banks here. But I've been in enough meetings to know that there isn't another magic bullet like that. That the key is really to build on what we have. And the brilliance of the Delaware Prosperity Partnership, bringing in a Merck, right, in Newcastle County, bringing in Wuxi in the southern Newcastle County part. I'm not at a stage where I want to start, reinventing the wheel of what could grow Delaware. I'm at the stage of building pillars that we already know work, like what the mayor is now doing in the Wilmington City Council with the vacant MBNA buildings, bringing insight downtown, building up an education hub in some of the other vacant buildings. That to me is how leaders should think about the future of our state, is building on what we already know works. And when you see a DuPont, you see the spinoffs from DuPont, this is where they want to be. The talented workforce, the experimental station, the investments in research and development, this is where the companies want to be. Our low tax base, our relatively affordable real estate. So I think it's wise to keep building on what we're doing and not lose sight of what makes us so strong. And I think, Charles, that's what you and I, concerns you and I when we see something like what just happened in the General Assembly is, there's enough chaos in Washington and some other states. Let's not bring that here. Let's remember what built this great state, and let's continue that.
It's funny you say that, because I agree with you completely. The Delaware way is very important. That's how you get things done. It's through study and compromise and discussion. That no one's completely wrong, no one's completely right. It's somewhere in the middle. And when people get together and work through their disagreements and compromise, that's usually the best solution of all. It's funny, when we first got to town, Amy and I have been here 20 years. No, what am I saying, 25 years? Sorry, time moves when you're having, fun. And I'll never forget, the plumber came in and totally messed up our bathtub. And I'm like, oh no, and I was about to get angry. And Amy pulls me aside and says, hey, don't yell at him, do not get mad. I said, why? You ruined our bathroom tub. She said, no. She said, because this is a small place. Go tell everyone in town you're a hothead. I said, I'm not a hothead. She said, I'm just mad about my bathtub. And so she just, be nice. So I go back in, and I said, hi. our bathtub really doesn't work. You know, is there something we can do about it? You know, smile. And he said, well, I'm glad you're really not upset about it. I said, well, a little bit. And he said, yeah, that's great. He said, I'm glad you're not a hothead like your neighbor. She's right. So you learn here to keep the tap. I have one question for you. I've got a historic. We got a little time, right?
We got, and then maybe a couple.
This is quick. Because I once read, and she had just taken over DOC, and she had the uniform. What was it like? I mean, you did not come from the corrections area, obviously law, but a different part of law. What was it like? In corrections, people are there long periods, if not the prisoners, but I mean the people work there.
Yeah, it's true.
Long periods. How did you deal with that? What was it like going into that?
Remember, Governor Carney had been in office 3 weeks, and 135 inmates took over an entire building and killed and murdered an officer and took several others hostage, including a counselor, and then held the building for 18 hours until the state police literally got a backhoe and ran through the concrete building with a backhoe. We had no cameras in any of our prisons then. Despite the fact that 13 years before, there had been a horrific rape of a counselor by an inmate in the same prison. And the #1 recommendation to the General Assembly for 13 years was you need to spend money to put cameras in all your prison so that you're not blind and inmates can't take over a building and kill an officer. So the governor said, you know, to ask me to work with the independent review team led by Bill Chapman and Bill Rotary. And their first report had like 2,000 recommendations. And I said, guys, we need something concrete. And so we rewrote it and came up with 41. And the #1 recommendation was get the money to put cameras in all your prisons. And my very first meeting with the then commissioner, like you said, grew up through the system, 30-year officer, had been the warden, had been the deputy commissioner, had been the bureau chief. I walk in and I'm like, hi, I'm your special assistant. And I said, you don't need a special assistant. His name was Perry. I said, you need an advocate. You need an advocate to get the money and to get these 40 things done. And he said, yeah, you can work with my secretary. Literally, he said, you can work. So I went back to the governor and he said, how'd it go? I'm like, all right, we got some work to do. My very first day on the job, I walk into Perry's office and he's slamming the phone down, cursing. God darn it, Claire, they're setting me up to fail. They're telling me I'm not going to get this $2 million for the cameras. It's going to take 18 months. I got to put it out to bid. I'm going to be dead before we see a single camera. It's going to be 13 years. And I said, Perry, give me a day. And you work behind the system, you know the chairs of the Joint Chief Finance Committee and the Bond Bill Committee. And I said, look, this money's been appropriated. There's a piece of our statute that's called the Critical Needs Exception. I've written the memo. There's a vendor already on state contract. Transfer the money to DOC budget tomorrow so we can get these cameras in. Mike Jackson was the budget director. Mike Jackson said, okay, we'll do it. Go into Perry's office and call me. Perry calls Mike Jackson. Mike Jackson said, Perry, I just transferred $2.5 million to your budget. Go get your cameras. Perry puts the phone down. Okay, you can stay.
That's the Delaware way.
And it was just building that trust. And then literally we divided the reforms into 3 categories. Those that needed to get done in 90 days. Those that needed to get done in 6 months. Those that would take a year. And every week we met with the team to get them all done. And then when Perry retired, the head of the Correctional Officers Union, a real bear of a guy, I adore him, but F-bombs every other word in a sentence. He went to the governor and said, there's one name you can send down to the General Assembly to be commissioner that will accept. And the governor said, I agree with you, there's no way she'll do it. But then when they came to me, you built the trust, you were part of a team that was the darkest day of ever in the history of the Department of Correction, and you built them up and you got things done and you built them around. I said, I'll do it for 18 months and I'll train somebody really strong and then they'll come in and run it. And then COVID hit and we had to get the prison system through COVID. So I ended up staying a little bit longer, but the best part of being the first woman is 2 years after me, there was another woman. And that was really important to me that I think the Department of Correction, because of all the reforms we made, not me, the team is stronger, I think, than ever in the history of Delaware. And it was, I think, to this day, the most meaningful thing I've done in my career.
Wow.
Take time for just a couple of questions.
I need a mic.
Oh, no, go, you keep the mic. You keep it. So you're going to be asked.
Here, we'll take that.
I'm just,
A short question, right?
Well, I'd like to give you a journalist question. President Landon mentioned our 110th anniversary. 50 years ago tomorrow, when I came to Delaware covering politics in the News Journal, it was the beginning of federal revenue sharing and the early days of that. My question really is about having your help in finding a strategic approach going forward to a new era where that federal revenue share that has built a $40 trillion deficit almost back to what used to be a fundamental principle in public management, which is money should be raised where it's spent. In other words, by local and by state government. That's a management principle those of us with my color hair learned in graduate school, and it's a principle that's been forgotten, and it's stranded agencies like Kathy's where we see that headline.
It's not something we'll do overnight or even in 4 years, but I can just say that I'm not going anywhere in terms of the chaos that's happening. I'm going to stick with it, and it will turn around, and we will get back to more normal governing and more normal, whether it's revenue sharing or making sure that we can pay our debts. There have been administrations that have paid off the deficit, and we'll get back there. Just for some reason in our country, we like to make it hard.
One more question before we finish. We good?
Well, it's wonderful to see so many friends and
Right.
new members. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Claire and Charles, thank you both for being here. So, as our way of expressing our thanks, I've got a kid's book here. So our club is knee-deep in all things early child education. So the notion that 90% of the brain development happens before the age of 5, so it's important. How are we doing in Delaware? Not where we need to be yet. So we're leaning in a number of ways. A hungry kid doesn't learn as well, Kathy, right? I don't think so. Yeah, so anyhow, we're going to give a book in both of your names to our 4 partners, Kingswood, Christina Cultural Arts, St. Michael's, and Latin American Community Center, is our way of thanking you both.
Thank you.
So thank you. Great program. Thank you both.
Yeah.
So we've got room for a half hour. Please hang around for some fellowship, and until we see each other again, engage in the magic of Rotary.